As we continue our week-long inquiry into the arts and global understanding, we're joined this morning by Tayo Rockson. The son of a diplomat, Mr. Rockson has lived in 4 continents and in 5 countries: Nigeria, Sweden, Burkina Faso, Vietnam, and the United States. Once he discovered that he was a TCK, or third culture kid, someone who spent the formative part of his childhood years outside of his parents' culture, he vowed to use his global identity to make an impact in the world. From his multicultural upbringing, Mr. Rockson founded and is CEO of UYD Management. UYD stands for Use Your Difference, a strategic leadership and consulting firm that helps corporations improve their bottom line by incorporating diversity, inclusion, and social justice strategies. A contributing writer at Forbes and author of The Ultimate Guide to TCK Living, he is also host of the As Told by Nomads podcast, which is the #1 cross-cultural podcast in the world and #2 business podcast in the world as ranked by Entrepreneur and CIO magazines. Mr. Rockson earned a bachelor's degree from Liberty University and an MBA from Fordham University. We're pleased to host him this week on this, his first trip to Chautauqua. Please join me in offering a warm Chautauqua welcome to Tayo Rockson.
Thank you. My check. Thank you so much. Good job. Thank you. Hi. Wow. Whew. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I've got to thank you, Matt, for that lovely introduction. This is obviously my first time here, and I've been enamored by the culture of Chautauqua. I was making a joke earlier that I live in New York City, but everyone always makes the mistake of thinking New York City is representative of New York, and it's always great to see such great tradition here. So, happy birthday, Chautauqua. 144, right? Happy birthday. I also want to congratulate the graduates today. It's a tremendous honor, and thank you all for continuing to extend that tradition. So, round of applause for the graduates. So, today's lecture, I would love for it to be interactive. I'm going to try and follow up on something that the Silk Road Ensemble did. So, can I count on you all to engage with me in some engagement? Can you all interact? Because I'm going to have Jordan here walk around, and he's going to pass mics during moments of my lecture, and we're going to discuss some critical, I feel, things that we need to discuss in today's world. Now, with that being in mind, I have the first soft question. All I need is just your hands, if this is something you relate to. So, have any of you ever had a nagging thought? Have any of you ever had... Oh, look at that. Okay, I'm talking about a thought that stayed with you no matter what you were doing. You were going to bed, it was right there. You woke up, it's boop, right there. Okay? Well, for me, that nagging thought has always been how to effectively connect across cultures. I wondered about this because of what was going on around me. You see, I'm Nigerian, and in the first 9 years of my life, I grew up in 2 military dictatorships. So a lot of what was going on around me was typically your hallmarks of great dictatorships. The suppression of opponents, the muzzling of the press, and countless human rights violations. Now, this was further complicated by the fact that Nigeria is a country with at least 250 ethnic groups, many of which were vying for ethnic domination, because a lot of them had been ingeniously left out of positions of national leadership. So when the time came for Nigeria to transition into civilian rule, you can imagine how I was feeling. I felt every single emotion you could feel on the spectrum that is emotions. I was excited, I was nervous, and I was skeptical. A part of me didn't believe that this was actually going to happen. But I remember the day. I remember the day like it was yesterday. It was May 29, 1999. I was seated on our colorful couch with my mom, my brother, and my dad. We sat across the television screen on the 10th floor in our apartment in Eric Moore Towers, Surulere, Lagos, and we watched as General Abdulsalami Abubakar was handing over power to Olusegun Obasanjo. And that thought creeped up again, this nagging thought. How does one effectively connect across cultures? Here is a man tasked with the responsibility of bringing together a bunch of people who had grown to distrust each other for years, decades, scores. I was so curious, how does one effectively connect across cultures? Little did I know that I would soon get the first clue to that answer, because about a year after that inauguration, my dad's job as a diplomat began to take us to different parts of the world. The first country was Burkina Faso. And so I found myself as this skinny Nigerian kid with a thick Nigerian accent in a French-speaking country in an American international school going through puberty. So in a place where everybody felt different, I felt different. I mean, this was the first time I remember seeing white people outside of my television screen. So I was looking for ways to connect, and for me, my way to connect, my default, has always been sports. And at the time, I played what, I call football. I think many of you call soccer. And but the only difference was whenever I looked around me, most people were playing basketball. And so I did what any 10 or 11-year-old would do when he or she wants to learn a new sport. I went to the library. I checked out all the books in basketball I could find. I found out that there were 2 doctors in basketball. There was Dr. Naismith, who invented basketball, and then there was Dr. J, who played for the Sixers. I was very thorough. I made sure I understood the rules of the game. What's a double dribble? What's a swish? What's a three-pointer? Who are the historians of the game? Who are the greatest to ever play the game? And once I was done, I needed to familiarize myself with the current landscape of the game. So I checked out the magazines on basketball, Sports Illustrated for kids. And when I was first getting into basketball, this is the time Kobe had an afro, this was Vince Carter, this was Allen Iverson, this was Chris Webber, Shaq. These were the players of my day. And so once I felt fully well-versed in the game of basketball, I decided it was time to translate that to the court. And so I went on this mission to find the best basketball player on campus. His name, Michael Albright. And once I found him, I remember nervously going up to him and saying, hey, Michael, I know everything there is to know about the game. I was like, I know this, I know this, I know this, I know this. Can you teach me how to play? And luckily he said yes. And our one-on-ones became 2-on-2s, and then 3-on-3s, and then 4-on-4s, and then 5-on-5s. All of a sudden, it didn't matter where we all came from. I had a Taiwanese teammate, had a Dutch teammate, had a Cameroonian teammate, an American teammate. I'm Nigerian. We had a common goal. That was to win. That's my first clue. Common goal. Establishing mutual purpose is so key when you want to learn how to communicate effectively across cultures. And I'll dive into that throughout the lecture, but that one experience opened my eyes to the possibilities of what a world could be like if we really extrapolated that experience on the court to life. It also led me down this quest of purposefully putting myself in different environments to learn how to forge and bridge cultural divides. I did all this not only because, as the son of a diplomat, I was now going to be a minority everywhere that I went, but because I firmly believe that this is how you, me, us, all of us, can change the world. If we look around the world today, we can see that due to the internet, migration patterns, we're experiencing a whole new world. The intersections of worldviews, ideas, cultures, religions is influencing every single policy that we have today and will continue to shift them tomorrow. So it's imperative for leaders of today and tomorrow to know how to navigate across these differences. It's no longer an option to just ignore them, because it's just a reality. That quest that I've taken for the last 18 years led me to the answer to that nagging question. The type of people that know how to effectively connect across culture do three things. They educate, they don't perpetuate, instead, they communicate. They educate, they don't perpetuate, instead, they communicate. And I'm going to spend the rest of the lecture dissecting each of these three things. So let's go into education. True education to me involves a few things: IQ, EQ, and CQ. And so, intelligence quotient, emotional intelligence, and cultural intelligence. The reason being, this gives us a better sense of who we are, how others see us, how we fit into the environment around us, and the implications of our actions. So who we are, how others see us, how we fit into the environment around us, and the implications of our actions. Essentially, what we're after here is education of ourselves and education of the environment. So let's tackle education of ourselves. This starts with truly understanding your biases. Now, I know it's very, when someone brings up bias, a lot of times people say, are you calling me a bigot? Are you calling me a sexist? Are you calling me a racist? But that's not the case. Bias is what makes us human, right? Every one of us here has a bias. Now, bias also is your inclination or prejudice towards, it could be inclination or preference rather, towards a certain group or individual based on your experiences. And your unconscious bias are the unconscious feelings that you have towards those biases. Scientists have said that at any given moment, our conscious mind can process 40 pieces of information per second, while our unconscious mind can process 11 million pieces of information. So it's very, very imperative to understand what exactly we're giving our brain to work through. Because our brains are malleable, and what you feed it is what it will get used to. And once it gets used to something, you start acting a certain way. So, in an effort to help understand what our biases are, I have one exercise that I'm going to have you all do here. Jordan, if Jordan's around, he's going to pass around a mic. I'm going to ask you all three questions. And if you have a pen, if you have a phone, or if you want to keep it mentally, it's fine. But get ready for these three questions. The first question is, what have my experiences been? When you're writing this down, I want you to leave enough space for a paragraph. What have my experiences been? First question. The second question is, what prejudices, biases, and stereotypes do I currently hold right now? Leave enough space for a paragraph. There's no judgment, no judgment. And the last question is, how much have I strayed outside of my comfort zone? So I'll go over the questions again. What have my experiences been? What prejudices, biases, and stereotypes do I hold right now? And how much have I strayed outside of my comfort zone? Okay, so let's go back to that first question. What have my experiences been? These are the probing questions I want you to dive into. First question. What were the last three places that you lived? Where were the last three places that you lived? Be super specific. Is it rural? Is it suburban? Is it, cosmopolitan? What are the characteristics of the place? Second question is, who are your three best friends? Be descriptive. White, black, gay, straight, Nigerian. Who are your three best friends? What values do you bond over? Be super specific. And then the last question is, who are the last three people you've been in relationships with? Who are the last three people that you've been in relationships with. If you can't go back as far as 3, it's fine. But, and if you haven't had any, it's also fine. But I want you all to dive into that. And as Jordan is going around for questions, I want a volunteer to tell me why I'm asking these questions. Any volunteer? Why I'm asking these questions? Hands. Oh, okay. All right, Jordan, I see a few hands. I'm trying to figure. Right here. Can you keep your hands up? Yeah, there you go.
So you can get to know us better. So you can communicate with us.
Okay. That's good. I like that. All right. Any other thoughts? Oh, wow. Everyone's up now. Okay. All right. Well, let me point to this lovely lady here in pink.
So you can see how what we say our beliefs are actually match up with what we actually do in our lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, both of you are spot on. The idea of what biases is or are is essentially, it boils down to 3 things. Biases are formed based on your past experiences, your childhood, and your exposure, right? And a lot of times throughout life, when we go through making decisions, we make certain decisions without understanding exactly why we make the decisions. Sometimes I've been in situations I do a lot of mentoring, and I've been in situations where I ask people, why do you think what you think? And their response is, well, it's just because. That's just the way it is. That's the way I was taught. And that level of critical thinking is something that we all have to get better about. Because sometimes what we think and what we do really has no basis because we've just been told those things. Okay? So I think that's enough time for you to have answered some of the questions. So anyone want to share who their 3 best friends are, what the 3 places they've lived in, the last 3 places they've lived in, and last 3 relationships they've been in? Anyone? We can't get shy now. Okay. Oh, wow. So I see a gentleman over there. I see another. I'm going to go with the lovely man in the beard.
Last 3 places I've lived, Boston, New York, and Hanoi.
Boston, New York, and Hanoi. What were the characteristics of those places?
Urban, cities.
Nice. Okay. And then the other questions? 3 best friends.
3 best friends.
Yeah.
White, Vietnamese, and white.
And then you don't have to share your relationships, but tell me.
I've been married 50 years, so.
I love love. But tell me what you think this tells you about your particular self. These questions.
I believe that I'm adventurous. I believe that my prejudice is that I think that Western culture is what I like to live in. And I believe that I am willing to learn from other cultures because I question people about their culture.
There you go. Okay. Thank you for sharing. Appreciate that. Interested. I'm going to take one more volunteer. This is going better. This is going better than I even expected. Oh, wow. I am very eager to hear yours.
Okay, I grew up in the city, Philadelphia, okay, and then...
Super Bowl champions!
Yeah. And then we moved to a small town in Maryland, Hagerstown, and right now we're in the suburbs, okay, of Philadelphia.
Philadelphia.
Okay. So, do you...
No, please. I'm very interested in hearing.
Okay, so there was a city, right? But then went to a school that was parochial, small Catholic, all girls, high school. And then I said the experience of this small town. That was interesting.
Yeah.
More varied beliefs, surprisingly to me, in some ways. and then the suburbs, typical suburbs kind of thing. And you get a little isolated and cloistered by, I guess, your neighborhood and the church that I go to. A lot of our friends are from our church, and we're Unitarians, okay? All right. Now, 3.
So it sounds like church is it's a very important part of your life. So values, okay.
Yeah. And
okay.
I grew up Catholic, so it changed.
Okay.
All right. So it got more expanded, okay?
Okay.
As I had more experiences. And then, now, what's the next one?
Three best friends and last 3 relationships.
Last 3. And it's almost the same, isn't it?
Yeah?
Yeah.
It could be.
Okay. One of my best friends is a neighbor in the suburbs. She was born in Puerto Rico, and she's a physician, okay? Then another best friend is my husband, right there, 49 years, okay?
Wow.
And he grew up in a rural area, but then he became, a businessman and more expanded. And then I guess one of my grandchildren would be one of my 3 best friends, I think.
Oh my goodness. Now tell me, just like that lovely gentleman over there, what you feel like this has told you about yourself and what maybe you've noticed some trends or not.
Yeah, I mean, you can really get isolated in your environment of that, but over years, if you move and you try, then you expand, hopefully. But there's always more room for expansion.
There you go.
Because I realized, hey, wait, now I'm in the suburbs, a lot of the same race, and my church, and then my family.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but then how to do that on a regular basis, make yourself experience other people, and sometimes our beliefs might not be religious or whatever, or political, might make us uncomfortable, but I mean, then what do you do? Yeah. But then we just got back from a reunion, Ron's rural reunion. His father was one of 10 children in a rural area not far from here, Waterford, Pennsylvania, and we all lived we lived together for a week, and we're all from different, rural city, different political, different religions. And so we just sort of cooked together and ate and visited and sort of kept it low key and didn't go where the hard stuff was. And then we saw we could get along, and maybe that way we can see we're not so different. You know what I mean? In some basics.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing this. I love the interaction, and we're going to dive into every single thing you said there. So the reason why I had all of you go through this exercise, once again, is to allow you all to remind yourself why you actually believe what you believe in the first place and who you surround yourself with. There's a great saying, you're the average of the 5 people you surround yourself with, but a lot of times who you are is determined by where you are. And if we don't check where we are, we might not realize who we are. It's a tongue twister. But so once you've done this, now the second question becomes, what stereotypes, prejudices, and biases do you hold right now? Now I'm just going to go through this and say, in my experience, that there have been, 3 primarily big reasons why people have prejudices or biases. And it's maybe fear, security, and avoidance. Now fear based on stories you've heard or experiences you've had yourself with a particular group of people or a particular person. Security makes you feel better about yourself, or you generally feel like you are doing something out of your own safety. And then avoidance, because this is a difficult issue, it's something you don't want to put yourself into, you don't want to be uncomfortable, and so you avoid it. And as you avoid it, you just continuously have these unconscious thoughts, and it gets filtered with things that you've heard from others, secondhand and third-hand information. Now, in the interest of time, I wouldn't ask you all what your biases and prejudices are, but I would encourage you all to do that amongst yourselves and think about those things. Is it fear, is it security, or is it avoidance? It's very important that we all be honest with ourselves, because if we don't know what to work on, we won't know what to change. And if we're not honest here, we can't be honest out there. Now, the last question I asked, how many of you have strayed outside of your comfort zone? I just want a show of hands for here. So, straying, okay, outside of your comfort zone, I'm defining this as you've intentionally, keyword, intentionally put yourself in a position where you are the minority on a weekly basis. Okay, so often. Okay, sometimes. Rarely. Never. So what happened to everybody else? Okay. It's very, very important. Like I said, biases are formed from your childhood experiences, your exposure levels, and your environment. So I want you all to think about that as you're going through. If we don't dutifully address what we are living in and who we surround ourselves with, we're not going to be able to really advance. Now, it's natural for you to want to cluster around people that have the same beliefs with you, and I love that. There's nothing wrong with that. But we have to be very careful, because if we do this, what becomes fortified are your thoughts and your beliefs, and then if your comfort zone is fortified, it's very hard for you to embrace new perspectives. And when you have a hard time embracing new perspectives, stereotypes are formed. So, change your experiences. So, that's the education of self. Let's move on to the education of the environment. I said earlier that my dad was a diplomat, and by the time I was 18, I had lived in 5 countries and 4 continents. Now, with each move, I would observe as my dad sought to maintain international relations with regard to peace, with war, trade, and things of the like. Very much like our esteemed Ambassador Stevenson was discussing yesterday. And as I observed this, I saw my dad pick up on a few habits. You know, I was a kid. You want to be like your dad. You watch your dad. And so he did a few things. He would pull up a newspaper. I know that's not common now, but in case there's anyone under 25, newspaper is a printed publication with a bunch of loosely held papers that has something like the news and sports scores. But that's just in education. But he would go through that front to back, and then he would flip on the television screen, CNN, BBC, and whatever the local news station was. Now, as a kid, I wondered, Dad, why do you do these things? And he looked at me. He said, Akintayo, the world is bigger than you. And if you want to succeed in it, you have to understand it. The world is bigger than you, and if you want to succeed in it, you have to understand it. What he essentially was doing was understanding the differences around him so he could find the commonalities that existed within them. And so as I observed him, I saw 3 ways with which he educated himself on the environment. And the 3 ways that you can all apply that to yourselves are as follows. First is to learn how to collect and gather information. Second is to become an active listener. And then the third is to be an active member of your community. They all play off each other. So collecting and gathering information. Remember when I asked you what your biases are and what your prejudices are? It's time to observe the group of people that you might feel uncomfortable around. What makes you uncomfortable about them? But what also, do they enjoy? What do they love? Observe body language. Observe basically what things bring them together. You can be an ethnographer. You can basically start reading on the history, like I was doing with basketball, reading on the current events. And then you can also start to listen to things like podcasts and books, but you have to make it intentional. The more you do this, the more you start to humanize a lot of the people or groups of people that you feel uncomfortable around. I said they all play off each other. The next thing to do is to become an active listener. Research shows that we only retain about 25 to 50% of what we hear, so it's no wonder why a lot of us have a hard time getting along. I mean, even if you look at the world, there's, Star Wars fans versus Star Trek fans, Patriots fans versus everybody else. There's all these divisions, Friends, Seinfeld, all these things. But something amazing happens when we commit to actively listening. Because actively listening is listening to learn, listening to understand, and listening to evaluate. Listening to learn, listening to understand, and listening to evaluate. It is not listening to confirm, which is what a lot of us do. We want to listen to confirm. It's like, I'm only filtering through what someone says that agrees with us. And if someone doesn't say something that doesn't agree with us, we just sort of filter that out. So, active listening. Another way to be an active listener, ironically, is by learning how to ask open-ended questions. This is where you take what you learn when you collect and gather information, to start asking open-ended questions. As you start to read about different cultures in your environment, you're going to be curious. You're going to be naturally curious. You're going to want to understand some certain things. And so it's best that you ask questions that invite people to tell you about themselves. Open-ended questions is the opposite of leading questions. So you're not saying, Odell Beckham Jr. is the worst person in the world, right? You're saying something like, wow, what do you think about Odell Beckham Jr. when you see him catching that football? What is your thought pattern? You're making sure your open-ended questions invites them to tell you something about themselves as opposed to you trying to get that confirmation. Active listening. This takes a lot of concentration and determination, but it takes a lot of asking, listening, and repeating. And if we don't get better about doing this, you're going to find that what you hear and what people actually say to you are both amazingly different. So, learn how to collect and gather information, and then become an active listener. The last way to become a good educator of your environment is to be an active member of your community. It's one thing to collect the information. It's another thing to investigate and then ask the questions. But how are you becoming an active member of your community? I mean, right now, how many of you all know who are the elected officials in your county, in your state, in your region? How many of you all know all the capitals of the cities around you? How many of you all know the demographics of the people that live around you? How many of you all know the religious demographics? Do you know all these things? Do you know who lives around you? No one. No, That's good. That's good. Now, if you don't know, this is not a bad thing. It's something that we all need to get better about. Because sometimes, a lot of what I've noticed is that a lot of us make decisions based on people we don't even know. This is why you have a situation where the same set of laws can affect different sets of people, because we don't know what the experiences are. And so a way for you to do this is, one, obviously, travel, pick a new language, but also commit. Goes back to what I was saying earlier, to being a minority where you can be. If there's a people of color group, go to that even if you're white. If there's a female group, go to that even if you're male, and vice versa. Find yourself doing things in places where you might even feel slightly uncomfortable, but there might be a common value, like sports, like music, or any of these things, or movie nights, or book clubs. Find those common values and go to areas where you typically might not, hang around in the communities. I'm not talking about going to quote-unquote dangerous neighborhoods or any of that. I'm talking about finding places where people might not look like you. And once you're able to experience this, the humanization process, the idea of seeing people as one as opposed to a group, becomes a lot easier. Once you commit to educating yourself and your environment, you get a better understanding of what makes people feel understood, and you also get used to equally as good alternatives. So that's educate. So, once you've educated yourself, it's time to make sure you're not perpetuating. How do you make sure you're not perpetuating? I'll give you an example. When I was 17 years old, that was the first time I came to the United States, I always got into interest in debates because I was this kid with a mostly American accent. And whenever I told people I was Nigerian, I had people looking at me like, you must be insane. You're not Nigerian. And they would get back and forth. We would engage in this interest in back and forth. And so I decided to play along. I asked them, well, tell me, what does a Nigerian or an African in general look like to you? And they'll be like, well, you should be blacker. And you're English. It's too good. It's too good. And then I looked at them and I said, I mean, that's very interesting. I mean, Africa, second largest continent, and we have several different pigmentations. But over a century ago, a few Europeans decided to colonize our continent. And they colonized our continent based on natural resources or things they felt would help their colonies. They separated people based on whatever they felt was good for them. And one of those colonies or colonizers was England, hence my English. They're like, nah. But still, this is not the representation I see there. Do you have cars? Yes, we do. Do you do you live in a hut? No, I don't. Do you have a gym? Yes. And then I will never, ever forget this. A guy, upon hearing I was Nigerian, came up in front of me and started carrying something imaginary. And then me and my friend were looking at this guy carrying something imaginary, and then he started to belt out, Nansigomnya Bagati Baba. This dude was straight up doing the Lion King. And just so, if anyone here comes across anyone from the African continent, this is not the best way to ingratiate yourself to an African. But I looked at him in shock and I was like, wrong region, bro. Lion King is based in East Africa. I'm from Nigeria, which is in West Africa. And then he was like, okay, but do you talk like this? I was like, okay. I said, that's a region in South Africa, and I'm from West Africa, and on and on and on and on. Of course I was mad. No one wants to be greeted into a new country like this, right? But my anger started to subside, and once I started to realize that this was actually coming from a place where people actually didn't experience this. A lot of the questions that people were asking was because this was their first interaction with someone that came from my country, and they were testing out what they had heard from friends, from people, or seen on TV, and using me as a guinea pig to test this out. It gave me insight into a few things, like how many of us trivialize other people's identities by using jokes, right? And how many people that are from the marginalized communities actually feel like they have to hide themselves so they don't get made fun of. Now, it's very easy to just say, you're being too sensitive. What are you talking about? Come on, it's fun, it's fun, it's fun. But you don't know how the other person feels, right? I also started to think about what happens if a kid sees his brother, mom, or dad do that. That kid goes on to his or her sphere of influence and starts to spread the story. I met this unicorn from Nigeria. He speaks like this, and he's from the Lion King, and they don't have huts, and this is how they drive cars. And that becomes the story that then goes on and plays into what I was talking about with your biases. And then you grow up thinking that, and then when you come across someone when you're 20s, 30s, and you react negatively, you wonder why that reaction came, or why you had that reaction. But that's because you were training your brain to accept that story. Don't perpetuate. Perpetuation doesn't only just lead to identity, it also leads to media. I love movies. I watch movies every week. So I remember being excited about a movie a few years ago, and it was called Gods of Egypt. And I'd heard pre-production that this was going to be about the Egyptian mythology. I love mythologies. And me being an African, I was like, I'm very curious about, Egypt and every country in the continent. And I remember looking at the trailer, and then there was no Egyptian in the trailer. In fact, it was everyone of European descent, and I kept looking. I was like, wait, what? This is about the Egyptians. What is going on? And I started to study trends, and sometimes when we're telling stories of different people, we cast the wrong people. But on the surface, that might seem innocent. But what happens is when you don't see enough of yourself in all these positions, people from marginalized communities say, well, there's no place for us. And then people in general that might come from the majority community start to get used to the idea that other people from different backgrounds, well, there's no way they could invent stuff. And that plays into those stereotypes. On the flip side, I don't know if anyone saw Black Panther, but it came out this year. Yes. Thank you. I saw Black Panther 5 times in the cinema. And this was the reason being is because it was the first time that a lot of what was made fun of was cool. It was cool to have the accent. It was cool to see people in different traditional outfits. You could wear the beads. You could wear any of these things. It was cool. And they were seen and depicted as superheroes. They were royalty. And when I went to the cinema, everyone that came from the diaspora was wearing all these things because they felt like they were part of that. And that's the danger of what happens if we perpetuate. We have to make space for different stories. Another way perpetuation plays into today's society is, I don't know if you all remember but in November 2016, there was an election that happened in this country. You guys remember? Oh, sorry. I'd say, so it took the world by storm. On one hand, you had Democrats. On the other hand, you had the Republicans. And in the big middle, you had a bunch of people who didn't identify with either. But one thing they could agree on was that there was a lot of, I guess, fake news, fabricated news. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is that a lot of people, thousands of people, fell for the allure of this fabricated news. Google had to ban over 200 sites from their AdSense network just to combat these algorithms. There's a whole industry built on clickbait news. And so we have to be better custodians and fact checkers of what's going on around the world. And then one of the best ways to do that, honestly, is really, I always have all these suggestions, but once you look at a site or news, the first thing you can do is to check the URL. Where's the URL? Is it .com, .co? Sometimes if it's a mask site that looks like CNN, Fox, or whatever, sometimes the URL is just obscure. It doesn't even match the website. Start off with looking at that. And then look at the About Us section. If someone is proud of their publication, proud of what they're doing, they would have no problem telling you who they are. And then look up quotes or lack thereof. And then when you find these quotes, verify these quotes. And then last but not least, you can look up a site called Snopes.com, SNOPES.com, whose sole existence is to basically cross-check and deal with myths and legends and things like that. But if we do not get better about checking something and then verifying, what happens is that we are going to end up creating several systems that promote insider and outsider dynamics. We're going to create these systems that only create echo chambers. And echo chambers are chambers that only allow you to be surrounded by people that confirm your beliefs. And when you have people that confirm your beliefs, dangerous messages can be used and weaponized in forms of propaganda and used to divide all of us. And if we do not, I keep saying this, if we do not get better about this, it's going to risk separating a bunch of people that could ultimately be together. Fake news occurs in two ways. One person is doing it purposely, or an organization is doing it purposely to spread a certain agenda, or you're reporting based on incomplete information. Incomplete information, watered down history, and stereotypes end up creating systemic problems that all of us grow into. And when you have insider and outsider dynamics, a lot of people have gulfs that they can't really see across each other. What happens in an insider and outsider dynamics? Well, the insiders feel like, or willfully or unwillingly, they operate in this system because it's optimized for them, and so they don't necessarily feel like there's anything wrong. And then the outsiders feel like they don't have their skills optimized, and so they constantly go back and forth with how to react. Should I react this way? Would I be seen as aggressive? Would I be seen as someone that's too soft-spoken? And if we don't even observe or realize that these systems exist, it just continues to have internal thoughts, internal dialogues in our head where you can say, I don't know why you're not doing this. It worked for me. And then the other person can say, why are you so angry all the time? What is the problem? I went through the same system. What are you complaining about? I'm going to illustrate this by talking about left-handed people. Nothing bad. Much of the world is right-handed, right? But almost everything from utensils to sports equipment to certain clothing is made for a right-handed person. You don't think about the experience of the left-handed person because you don't have to deal with it. And just because you don't deal with it or deal with things doesn't mean that that experience is not happening. And so a sense of belonging is something I want everyone to remember. Is something that we all want to have. And if we don't do a better job of creating these stories that are accurate, inviting more people and creating more stories through the media and through our jokes, and also being better custodians of stuff that we share and verify, if we don't do a better job of just clicking send or reshare based on a headline without actually reading We are going to create the system where no one is listening, and we're going to perpetuate certain stories. And once you perpetuate, you don't have space for people to listen. Once you perpetuate, you create systems of discrimination, intentionally or unintentionally. But I want you all to remember this. If you're part of the problem, you can be part of the solution. If you choose only to educate and not engage, you're perpetuating. If you choose only to educate and you're not engaging, you're perpetuating. So that's the perpetuating aspect of today's lecture. Last part is instead communicate. So, some of you at this stage might be saying, look, Tayo, what's your name anyway? I've educated myself. I make sure I don't perpetuate. So, what happens when I come across people that have different values for me? You know, what about that? You know, people that think differently from me. How can I possibly engage with that? And I want you all to think about this. This is breaking news. The idea that you have to choose between making a friend and sharing your opinion is not a good option. It's an option we have to get rid of right now, because we do not live in a binary world. We live in a world of nuance that is governed by binary systems. And if we have to feel like we can't express ourselves just to say our truth, we have a problem. We have a legitimate problem. And so, get rid of that mindset that you can't speak your mind for fear of, alienating yourselves. Another thing is, silence is not the answer to this as well. Because as the great, late Martin Luther King Jr. said, our lives begin to end the moment we become silent about things that matter. Our lives begin to end the moment we become silent about things that matter. So what do? Well, examine your motives. Before any conversation, once the conversation gets really contentious, I want you to ask yourself a series of questions. What is my goal for this conversation? You know, what do I want out of this conversation? What do I want from this person out of this conversation? What do I want for myself out of this conversation? And what do I want from the relationship moving forward? Great questions. But after you've asked yourself these questions, ask yourself this: how will I act if that's what I want? How will I act if that's what I want? Most people do the first part. They ask all themselves those great questions, and then they don't ask themselves how they will act. Because a lot of us are too concerned with defending our points that we miss out on how we come across. And so, doing this allows you to, one, get reacquainted with the goal of the conversation, and two, take charge of your body. When you're asking yourself, hey, okay, I'm yelling, I'm shouting, I'm doing this, well, how will I act if I want this? You have a brief moment to take control of your body, breathe, and then reconsider your next words. So that's one way, examining your motives. But what happens if it's just you doing this and then the other person is still committed to then it's very important to understand that the reason why this is happening is that, one, they don't trust your motives, and they don't think that you care about their goals in the conversation. So you can do two things. You can practice the yes and, or you can step out of the content of the conversation. I'll dissect these two. So what is the yes and? Now, if they're improv artists here or comedians, some of you would know what the yes and is. Yes and is basically a situation where no matter what scenario is presented to you, you accept the scenario, you don't belittle it, you don't negate it, you don't push it away, you accept the scenario, you build on it, and then you volley it back and forth. Let me give you an example. Let's say there are two people. Person one hates LeBron James, and person two loves LeBron James. So person one goes, I hate LeBron James, he's so selfish. And then person two says, okay, I love that you value compassion and selflessness. I also value compassion and selflessness. This is the yes. And then you're building on it with the and now. here are some instances where LeBron did this moments. Now, the other person is like, okay, yeah, I see that. And the person is not going to change their mind, by the way. But what happens is that you go from adversarial to conversational, where the person says, okay, yes, okay, in that situation he does that, but here I don't like when he does that. But the whole tone of the conversation has changed. You can exist even if you have different values and different beliefs. But isn't the conversation so much better where you could have gone to like, well, Michael Jordan is better. What about Kareem? What about this? And you just went to like, okay, I see what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. I still feel this way, but I get you now. Adversarial, conversational. Yes, and. What that does is it lets go of your ego, creates more possibilities and more openness. So less ego, more openness, and more possibility. Ego is the biggest reason why when we get into conversations, we don't want the other person to agree, because we are seeing the world through our filters, and we can't really fathom the idea that someone else can dare disagree with us. But we understand, this is something I want you all to remind yourself of, 7 billion people live in this world, and we have different filters. We went through the exercise where your filters were determined by your environments. And so if everyone has different filters, it is very understandable why different people might see things differently. We have to remind ourselves of that, okay? The other thing is to step out of the content of the conversation. Basically, step out. Now, you could do this physically by changing the location. You can say, hey, look, maybe we should take a pause, okay? This is obviously not working. Let's go for a walk and do that. But another thing is to restate the goal and say, look, let's just talk about everything on the table. You believe this, I believe this, I believe this. We have this goal. We need to work together for this project. Our kids go to the same school. We're on the same team. How can we move forward? And then state all these things. But also, state what assumptions you're operating under. Say, look, I just want to say this is how I feel based on what you're saying, and all my assumptions, right or wrong, are this, and invite the other person to share their assumptions. And once you have these assumptions on the table, drop your assumptions. And also drop your need to be right. The need to be right is also the byproduct of ego. And once you've done that, try and figure out how to then find the common value. At the very least, we all want security, we all want safety, and we all care about our families. The problem exists when we have different ideas about how to be safe and care about our families. And so if we can at least agree on the fact that we're human and we care about safety, we can then build towards that. But the humility of saying what you're operating from and the biases you're operating from and the stereotypes you're operating from immediately disarms people, and they say, okay, fine, so you think Muslims are like that. All right, that's why you're saying this. And you think that happens. I'm glad that you said it, but please, I just want you to understand that that's where I'm coming from. And the other person, maybe could say, okay, fine, I'm glad that you said that, but that's not the case. Not all Muslims are this. This is how we do this. And I would really appreciate it if you stop making these assumptions based on that. And maybe we can finally get to have that conversation. Communication is the language of leadership. And I'm always reminded by a quote from George Bernard Shaw when he said that the single biggest illusion with communication is the thought that it's taken place. And it's so true. Many of us think we've communicated when we haven't communicated. But we have to remember that communicating is not just us wanting to be understood. It's about wanting to understand others as well. It's not about us just wanting to be understood. We have to have a willingness to understand where the other person is coming from. So educate. Don't perpetuate. Instead, communicate. Ladies and gentlemen, there are 2 reasons why people don't feel like they can change the world today. That's fixed mindsets and limited worldviews. People with fixed mindsets seek to validate themselves. And people with growth mindsets seek to develop themselves. But we can't afford to be this short-sighted, because when you change the way you see things, the things you see change. The work to change the world does not end at the offices of law enforcement or governments. It begins with us, in our backyards, in our schools, in our spheres of influence, and in our minds. And so, we all have to be mindful of our actions because all of us here are symbols of, in some shape or some form. You can be symbols of love and tolerance, or you can be symbols of hate and intolerance. But whatever you're doing in private or in public matters because it does have the ability to shape policies today and tomorrow. So let's make sure our actions are celebrating differences, being a voice for the voiceless, and creating space for people that might not look or act like us. To this point, I'm reminded of a stand-up special that's one of my favorites. It's called Homecoming King, and it's performed by a gentleman called Hassan Minhaj. And in this stand-up, Hassan recounts a story in which his father tells him something that strikes him. His father says to him, Hassan, your courage to do what's right has to be greater than your fear of getting hurt. So Hassan, be brave. Hassan, be brave. Your courage to do what's right has to be greater than your fear of getting hurt. So Hassan, be brave. Hassan, be brave. I thought that was very powerful because history is made by those who have the courage to act. And so my call to action for you all today is this: educate. Don't perpetuate. Instead, communicate. Because the fact of the matter is you all have a choice. You can choose to see a world as is and do nothing about it. Or you can choose to see a world that's hurting and participate by changing the narrative. Whichever choice you make, you're changing the world in some shape or form. My choice is that you choose the latter. And so I leave you with this question. Will you use your difference to make a difference? Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, man. Wow. Thank you. Thank you.